After giving transcendental wisdom to King Citraketu, now Narad Muni finds the, the right opportunity to introduce Citraketu with the mantra. And the mantra is distributed over 9 verses. And that's what we are studying. So today we are going to do 4 out of those 9 verses. And in these verses, we will learn the categorical difference between the living entity and the Supreme Personality of Godhead. I think this is a good section to meditate on in order to thoroughly understand what is the difference between the Supreme Lord and us. See, we all have qualitative oneness with the Supreme Lord, and at the same time, we are quantitatively tiny in comparison with the Supreme Lord. So, if we have to understand how we are quantitatively tiny and different from the Supreme Lord, this mantra that Narad Muni is giving is encapsulating the underpinnings of that understanding. So Narad Muni begins with respectful obeisances to and meditation on one transcendental Lord who is worshipped and addressed in many different ways. So, first way he's talking about is in the form of Omkar or Pranava. Second, Chaturvya, which is basically Vasudev, Pradyumna, Aniruddha, and Sankarshana. Thirdly, reservoir of all spiritual potency. Fourth, the spiritual bliss. And fifth, the self-sufficient. The sixth, the most peaceful. Seventh, the ultimate truth. Eighth, the unequaled. And ninth, the reservoir of knowledge. And in this way, he is realized as Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. So this is how Narad Muni is introducing the Supreme Lord. In the purport to the text number 18 and 19, Srila Prabhupada explains how the Supreme Personality of Godhead fulfills each of these names and characteristics. Okay, so very, very detailed purport here. So let's take a look at this purport a little bit. So Prabhupada writes, in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that he is Pranava Sarva Vedeshu, the syllable Om in the Vedic mantras. In transcendental knowledge, the Lord is addressed as Pranava Omkara, which is a symbolic representation of the Lord in sound. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Vasudev, who is an expansion of Narayana, expands himself as Pradyumna, Aniruddha, and Sankarshana. If you want to take a look at what Prabhupada writes in the 6th canto, 9th chapter, 33rd verse, where Prabhupada gives an explanation of Chaturvyuha there, that when he is realized as Vasudev, Sankarshana, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha, the Chaturvyuha, who are beyond the 3 forms of Vishnu, he is the Vaikuntha Narayana. And in the same purport, then Prabhupada gives a methodology by which one can realize that all these realizations are possible when one engages fully in devotional service. The covered core of one's heart is there completely open, is then completely open to receiving an understanding of the Supreme Personality of Godhead in its various forms. So the key point here is that the Chaturvyuha is referred to as the Vaikuntha Narayana. Okay. Now we can return back to the 18th and the 19th purport, where Prabhupada gives a further description of how from Sankarshana there is the Narayan expansion, and then from this Narayan expansion, there are these manifestations of the Chaturvyuha forms. And then furthermore, Prabhupada writes, as confirmed in the Brahma Samhita, all these forms of the Supreme Personality of Godhead are Advaita or non-different, and they are also Achyuta or infallible. They do not fall down like conditioned souls. The ordinary living entity is prone to falling into the clutches of Maya, but the Supreme Lord in his different incarnations and forms is Achyuta or infallible. Therefore, his body is different from the material body possessed by the conditioned soul. So you can see, in this way, we will start actually getting a lot of insights into the difference between the living entity and the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So Prabhupada does this following in the footsteps of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, where Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, in this context, he says that the Lord has a form of the highest bliss, whereas the conditioned jiva has a form made of the 5 material elements. Then the Lord finds bliss in his own nature, whereas the jiva finds bliss in material sense objects. The Lord is not attached to the material world, whereas the jiva is attached. So these are the characteristics of the fallible versus infallible. You know, like as pointed out by Srila Prabhupada in that purport. Then after that, Srila Prabhupada goes into describing the meaning of the word matra. Okay, that matra karna vibhushayam vitte mane parichade. The word matra in its different imports is used to indicate the decoration of the ear, possession, respect, and the possession of a covering. And then Prabhupada relates that to the Bhagavad Gita 2.14, where the idea is to tolerate the temporary manifestations of happiness and distress, which are just like seasonal changes. So in the conditioned state of life, the body is used as our dress, and as one needs different dresses, during the summer and winter, we conditioned souls are changing bodies according to our desires. However, because the body of the Supreme Lord is full of knowledge, it needs no covering. The idea that Krishna's body is like ours, in other words, his body and soul are different, is a misunderstanding. There is no such differences for Krishna because his body is full of knowledge. Here we receive material bodies because of a lack of knowledge. But because Krishna, Vasudev, is full of knowledge, there is no difference between his body and his soul. So, in this way, Prabhupada elaborates on the point of how actually the living entity is fallible while the Supreme Lord is infallible. And therefore, the Lord is addressed as Vijnana Matraya Paramananda Murtaya. Okay? And then, furthermore, Prabhupada writes, because the Lord's body is full of knowledge, he always enjoys transcendental bliss. Indeed, his very form is Paramananda. This is confirmed in the Vedanta Sutra, Anandamaya Abhyasat. By nature, the Lord is Anandamaya. Whenever we see Krishna, he is always full of Ananda in all circumstances. No one can make him morose. Atmaramaya, he does not need to search for external enjoyment, but he is self-sufficient. Shantaya, he has no anxiety. One who has to seek pleasure from other sources is always full of anxiety. Karmis, Gyanis, and Yogis are full of anxiety because they want something, but a devotee does not want anything. He is simply satisfied in the service of the Lord who is fully blissful. And then finally, Nivritta Dvaita Drishtaya. In our conditioned life, our bodies have different parts. But although Krishna apparently has different bodily parts, no part of his body is different from any other part. Krishna can see with his eyes, and Krishna can see without his eyes. Therefore, in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, it is said, Pashyati Achakshu. He can see with his hands and legs. He does not need a particular bodily part to perform a particular action. Angani yasya sakalendriya vrittimanti. He can do anything he desires with any part of his body, and therefore he is called Almighty. So now you can see how Narada started that the Supreme Lord is addressed and worshipped in countless ways. Like he can be referred to as Omkar, he can be referred to as Chaturvyuha, the reservoir of all spiritual potency, the supreme bliss, self sufficient, the most peaceful, the ultimate truth, the unequaled, and the reservoir of knowledge. So this is how Narad Muni begins. Then in the 20th verse, Narad Muni, through the prayers or through the mantra, he shows how to offer respectful obeisances to the blissful Supreme Lord. So he says that perceiving your personal bliss, you are always transcendental to the waves of material nature. Therefore, my Lord, I offer my respectful obeisances unto you. You are the supreme controller of the senses, and your expansions of form are unlimited. You are the greatest, and therefore I offer my respectful obeisances unto you. So Prabhupada now goes into further expansion on the difference between the Jiva and the Supreme Lord in his purport. So Prabhupada writes, the Lord's body is transcendental, spiritual, but because the conditioned soul has a material body, he has many bodily and mental troubles. Okay? The conditioned soul is always perturbed by attachment and detachment, whereas the Supreme Lord is always free from such dualities. The Lord is the supreme master of all the senses, whereas the conditioned soul is controlled by the senses. The Lord is the greatest, whereas the living entity is the smallest. The living entity is conditioned by the waves of material nature, but the Supreme Lord is transcendental to all actions and reactions. The expansions of the Supreme Lord's body are innumerable. Advaitam Achyutam Anadim Anantarupam, but the conditioned soul is limited to only one form. From history, we learn that a conditioned soul by mystic power can sometimes expand into 8 forms. But the Lord's bodily expansions are unlimited. This means that the bodies of the Supreme Personality of Godhead have no beginning and no end, unlike the bodies of the living entities. So, in this way, you can see there are so many factors in which we can establish the difference between the living entity, which is tiny, and the Supreme Lord, which is or who is the greatest. And then Narad Muni is invoking protection from that Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is always blissful. That may the Lord, who is pure consciousness and the cause of matter, protect us. So he's saying the words and mind of the conditioned soul cannot approach the Supreme Personality of Godhead, for material names and forms are not applicable to the Lord, who is entirely spiritual, beyond the conception of gross and subtle forms. The impersonal Brahman is another of his form. So then finally he's saying, may he, by his pleasure, protect us. So Prabhupada offers a very short purport in this, and he indicates what that impersonal Brahman is. The impersonal Brahman, which is the effulgence of the Lord, is described in this verse. And by invoking that Brahman aspect of the Supreme Lord, Narad Muni is showing how to actually um, request for protection through the mantra. And we are going to continue with this mantra, and how we will see that that mantra finally converges in the Purusha Shukta prayer. So thank you very much.